in this conversation. I will briefly give you a few notes on Walead Beshty and his career, very short version, since we're looking forward to what he has to tell us in his reconstruction of his path. Walead Beshty is born in 1976 in London, UK. He's an artist and writer, working in Los Angeles, and recent solo exhibitions have been presented at Kunstmuseum Winterthur, at the MAMCO in Geneva, at the Barbican Center in London, the Power Station Dallas, Allen Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, and the Malmö Konsthall in Sweden. Of course, his works are in many museum collections, including the Guggenheim Museum, New York, the Hammer Museum, Los Angeles, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, New York, Tate, London, and many more. He has published books, edited books. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about this editing activity as well. And you can also find 3 monographs, including his works or treating his work, that have been published in the last 10 years, among others by G.R.P. Rignier, Walead Beshty, Natural History, or by Koenig Books only last year, 2020, Walead Beshty, work in exhibition from 2011 to 2020. These books are, of course, available in our libraries, and you might want to check them out. So welcome again, Walead. You haven't had a chance to talk until now, and I'm very happy to leave you the floor for starting this conversation.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for having me. This is my first kitchen table artist lecture, so it's a kind of surreal experience, and hopefully it'll have the positive aspects of that informality and less of the negative aspects of that informality. So thanks so much for setting this up. And I thought that I would start by, you know, before we just initiated this this collective Zoom, or before you guys all were at it, we were talking a little bit about the professional conditions of being an artist, the ambiguities of it, and Gabrielle, that you were teaching a classes about, you know, kind of this understanding of the art field. So, you know, I thought I'd just say a little something biographically, is that when I was a student, and I think always my conception of art was that it wasn't just, I think my intent was that I never really wanted to be an artist per se, but I wanted to participate in a discourse about aesthetics. And I didn't quite know what that would be. And through art school, it led me into writing, and writing was actually the first way that I could participate. It was a way to put my voice out there. You know, I started writing reviews and things like that before I even ever had a formal show. So that was a very important initial introduction for me. And a lot of the artists that I think were most formative to me in the beginning were mostly artists from the 60s and 70s. And I think that there was an integration at that point very much between, especially in the conception, I think it's more so the case in the States, where these integrated ideas of the role of the artist have begun to diverge a lot. And I would just say, from my contemporary experience, I don't think that that's necessarily the model that I see that my students relate to, or my previous students relate to. But for me, it was always integral. So my idea was that artists taught and participated in a discourse in that manner, that they wrote to some extent, that it and for me, it was very much about finding any means any means possible to participate, finding a form for participation. And it just so happened that the term artist started applying to my mode of participating in a discourse about aesthetics. And we can circle back to that, and sorry if that was a little circuitous, but it was always part of my professional understanding of what being an artist was. So, just thinking about, eau de cologne and artist writing and things like that was always very significant for me. Or interfunctionen, all of those sort of premises of artists existing in these multiple platforms and formats. The other thing I wanted to do was just sort of lay out a bit more theoretically how I think of the practice, and I try to just be a bit transparent. And on a fundamental level, I think about art as being a discourse about aesthetics that occurs through aesthetics. So rather than a linguistic discourse about aesthetics, that it's an aesthetic discourse that is reflexive about aesthetics. So much like philosophy or linguistics is a language-based or language-based discourse about language or thought, thought about thought. Art being an aesthetic communication that is about the status of aesthetic communication. And I tend to favor, when I say aesthetics, I think of that in the Greek sense, the classical Greek sense of the term, which is perception or relating to perception through the senses, right? So fundamentally, right, it has to do with bodily experience. And secondly, it's understanding that comes through sensation. So it's knowledge obtained through bodily experience to me. And in that sense, it's also distinctly social, much in the same way that language or discussion, right, is about creating a communes or a group. I think aesthetics creates kind of communal experience, right? It establishes a set of shared sensorial understandings. So, and it's conventional, but it also has certain degrees of improvisation built into that kind of mechanism. And I think as soon as you start talking about the social commons, you have to address questions of the political. And in that way, art for me is also distinctly political, thinking of political as being the polis, about the citizenry of the city, right? Polis city. So it's about inclusion and exclusion. And establishing that commons is about who participates in that communal discourse and who is excluded from it. So art is a mechanism to examine those conditions of inclusion and exclusion. Again, for me, that's my improvised over the course of my professional career that's my improvised understanding of how I would try to explain what it is I do and how I see my role in relationship to a broader sense of a public or a community or a social role. I think once you get to this political question, the idea of power comes up, and power and authority through social systems often is about concealing, right? About not showing how it works, because that makes power more self-validating, less accessible. So to me, it was always a political question to try to produce works in a way that was transparent, to not, to make them open source, to use a kind of term from programming, to not create a mystery around why they are the way they are, why they look the way they do. So transparency in a way was a governing metaphor for me. And I think that what I learned from practices in the 60s was a kind of democratization of aesthetic practice, increasingly moving into public spheres, increasingly de-emphasizing the specialness of a particular object and looking to circulatory or communication systems that were public and available, accessible. I hope that wasn't too dense or convoluted, but again, in an effort to be transparent, I thought I should just try to lay that out. So I think one of the earliest works that is strongly associated with my practice are these FedEx works, and I think they illustrate some of these ideas pretty well, or at least the aspirational dimension of it. So I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see. There we go. And where's that tab? Oh, look, I can just share. Okay, sorry. See, there's the kitchen table part coming up. So just to explain these works, they're made out of shatterproof glass, the kind that's usually found in architectural facades. It's not car windshield glass, which is made to break into chunks, but it's made to not break apart. So it has a gel medium in between the two panels of glass. And there's an anecdote that I sometimes tell about these, which is that I was living in Los Angeles. I first started them in 2006, and I had a show in Berlin, and all I had was my gallery's FedEx account number. So it was a way of just trying to think, how do I work within these constraints? And I think that's an important subtext to how I think about my practice, is that, you know, life is operation within constraint, within confines. There are societal constraints, behavioral constraints. Some constraints are soft, some constraints are hard. So one way to solve this sort of problem is, how do I have an international or a show overseas with my own budget, with what the gallery was willing to offer, and was how do I make a work that sort of uses that as a basic condition of my practice. So FedEx is, basically FedEx has standardized box sizes that are SSCC coded, standardized shipping container code. That's part of the GS1 standard that's out of Belgium, Brussels. And it's an international standard that's linked up to the ISO, International Standards Organization. And basically it's a proprietary volume of space. So DHL can't ship or issue a box in the same exact dimensions as FedEx, right? These are proprietary things. So not only does FedEx own the design of the box, they also own that shape. And I was thinking about the modular and the history of, say, minimalist practices, but back to, you know, even when you think of, oh, I just lost the Impressionism. Seriality is fundamental to modern history of art and working within serial confines. So this was a kind of corporate serial organizational form. The other thing I wanted was that a work that first would change each time it's seen. In other words, every time it's shown, it's shipped in that box. It cracks according to how it was handled, all the labor that's involved in getting it from point A to point B. And then I also produced them in two-way mirror glass, which is also an architectural style glass. So I was thinking about architectural forms, the basic form of the gallery as a module, the form of the shipping container, which is of course key to any art exhibit, and thinking about those as sort of confines on the practice. The other thing in a more material sense was that glass is something that you can't see in isolation. So you always see a reflection of yourself, the room. It's highly conditional, right? If the time of day changes, the work changes, And that's an example of the titling, which is overly descriptive on purpose. And that's also a way to sort of alleviate this sort of question of what was the artist thinking? Well, this is the very simple description of how it was made and what what the work is. There's no mystery in that sense. And I think in that way it was very much a reaction. I mean, I had a great admiration for, and still do, Saul LeWitt and Michael Asher and Hannah Darboven, and these various practices that used various forms of transparency and description to, I think, create a more democratic notion of the aesthetic object. And that's an annotated version of the titling. If it's interesting, I don't know, it's probably too short of a situation to really get into that. The flip side was around the same time I started passing film through my checked baggage. It started as an accident. I was photographing, I'm not going to show those works, but I was photographing the former Iraqi embassy to the former East Germany. And there are a bunch of very specific political situations around that site that made it special. And it's a very long thing to describe, so I'm not going to do it now. But what interested me was that in the movement across international borders, you have this threshold that's produced by the X-ray. And as an artist, I had to travel a lot, and I was constantly going through X-ray machines and constantly traveling, or not constantly, but traveling at a somewhat regular pace. And I wanted to use that labor, the byproduct of this transport, in a kind of analogous way to the FedEx boxes. So you think of shipping as a means of production, and in this case, travel was a means of production. So that's the actual scanner on a 4x5, that's the beam of the X-ray. And of course, that's also a visual technology that is deeply intertwined with the history of photography. Röntgen, who discovered the X-ray, X-rayed his wife's hand on a sheet of film, and that's how it sort of discovered the X-ray process. And so, but it also was a way to produce and to make something out of the common activity of being an artist. I was asked to go places, and so this was a way that my travel generated the practice, in some sense. So you can see these are all titled with the airport codes and the various travel, and I don't do anything to them. This is just the film, and they're printed at 1:1. Initially, I enlarged them, and I realized that was stupid, so I performed a corrective. And now they're just printed 1:1 and presented by year. And these were in the Winter Tour show. But I'm just going to scroll through a few of these. Let's see how many I have here. And this, for example, is 1 year of them, and they're grouped by year, which is somewhat arbitrary, but you have to start with some organizational pattern, right? So years are an easy one. And that's an example of the title for the piece. It says the type of film, et cetera, et cetera. And once I start doing something, I feel obligated to continue doing it until I'm not allowed to anymore. So I'll keep making these as long as I travel for work or until they stop making the film, which I hope they do. So this is an early image of them when I enlarged them, again, to just show warts and all, rethinking one's practice and redefining it. On the floor is a mirrored floor work. This was kind of came along the same thought process of making a mirrored floor that cracked as viewers used the space. So it would crack in the pattern of the way that the physical movement through the space is. This is Moscow. It also went into the office spaces as well. So it was a work that directly responded to the use of the room, the way people move through the room, both for work activities, but also for viewing activity. And similar to the FedEx, it doesn't exist until it's actually shown, right? And I was trying to think of what would be a work that doesn't exist until it's exhibited. And so this was a way of trying to address that. This is Brandeis, a show I organized which I won't get into. It's another exhibition of it. I like it best when it's not with my work, when it's with other people's practice. So it's the curated show. When I showed it in Beijing, they asked me to put it in my show because no other artist would agree to have it in their room. So that's how it goes. So let me get out of this for a second. Around, oh, that was the image I was looking for anyway. Okay. Let's see how I'm doing. So a few years later, I was also thinking about another way that touch or work or labor, basically the invisible labor of the traffic of art objects, could be used as a generative form. And copper, I'm not really sure. Oh, I saw a Donald Judd stack in LACMA, and it had a big fat thumbprint on the side of it. And it was a copper Judd stack. Now, all the Judds get re-ground down to remove all of those blemishes. But I thought it was quite beautiful because it was evidence, you know, of course, the Judds appear almost like the monolith from 2001. They kind of appear, ta-da, you know, this big thing, right? And to see this evidence of a physical trace, that there was a person who put it on the wall, that they had to drill into the wall, that kind of fascinated me. And it felt like it made the work more everyday. I started to think of Judd's as in a more familiar way. It really disrupted a kind of power that it had. It made it more of a familiar object and a real thing rather than an image of a thing. And what I realized is that that would work similarly with the FedEx box. In other words, that people touch and carry it from place to place. So these are only exposed to full contact in the process of their transfer. And it's a material trace of the way a particular shape and form needs to be handled. You see that there's a pattern produced because the corners are grabbed onto, there's hand smears in the centers, but that there's a different pattern that's produced simply because of this corporate shape that is predefined by FedEx. So here's a bunch of them. There's a titling. I'm going kind of slow, but let's see if I can speed up a bit. I think we're only at 2010 now. So I will try again. So I'm not going to talk too much about the photography, but here I will talk about this. Around the same time, I began producing tabletops for exhibition spaces. And I was interested in the table and furniture as a kind of ready-made. And one way that I think about, or I thought about how to approach my work, is to take the idea of the ready-made, or at least my interpretation of the ready-made, which I mean is stolen from Thierry de Duve as well. I mean, reading his book, I think it's Pictorial Nominalism, it made me think about the ready-made in a different way. And he said, the ready-made is a pact. It's an agreement. It's a kind of, it's a thing which causes an agreement among individuals to discuss something in a certain way. So what Duchamp brought forward was that art is a kind of social agreement. Aesthetics is a social agreement to understand an object in a certain way, right? We make a deal. We're like, we're gonna call this art and we're gonna not call that art. And we collectively make that deal. So really the support of a sculptural object is a social support, right? That allows discourse comes to frame an object as much as an exhibition space, as much as a plinth, as much as a frame, as much as any of those containers. Discourse is another frame, another container. And I began thinking about how galleries' designs, the kind of taste that they have for their furniture affects the understanding of what my practice was. So this was one, so you can kind of see the process. There was replacing the tabletops with polished copper. That oxidizes, of course, when it's touched. So it's mirror finished. And then as it's used and touched over the duration of one exhibition period, it's soiled or stained or oxidized, really. And there's it in use. And that was the final result. So it's only used as a workspace in this instance, and then presented as either an object on the wall or a sculptural object with its base. So that's another gallery director's office. And there's the final result. And there's the support. So that was a Saarinen table. So I was really interested in like showing in various exhibition spaces. One gallery might have an IKEA table, one has a Saarinen table. How does that affect the understanding of the work? And that this was also a kind of ready-made, right? It was a form predetermined by the space that had to do with taste, cultural taste, and a kind of framing of my own practice within those tastes and values. And I wanted to use that as a way to make a decision. So I'm going to kind of skip ahead there. Are there any questions, or am I moving too fast or too slow or something?
So from my point of view, you're moving in an ideal speed. I don't know what you preview to come, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to tell everyone that you're, of course, very welcome to already start to type in your questions into the chat. I might sort them out a bit and bundle them towards the end, or if something immediately very pressing comes up, we can of course also address that. But for the time being, I would say, please, Walead, just feel free to continue with this.
And pressing is great. If someone has an urgent question, that's fantastic. Takes the pressure off me. So what I think, it's 6:30 now, I wanted to show a video, which basically is a walkthrough of my exhibition. Right? That was what we figured out, right? That you would show it?
Yes. And also maybe some people notice that there is sometimes the connection, Walead's connection is a bit unstable. We can unfortunately not do anything about that, but we sorted it out so far. So please bear with us. And I am now showing the video you envision from my computer. So could you please stop your screen share?
Oh yeah, I'll stop.
Thanks.
Or I think it stopped.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Being in a context with iconic works of the modernist period brings out aspects of my works that are not usually discussed. For example, one through line of 20th century art is the prolonged investigation of perception. Modernist art draws attention to perception through fragmentation, breaking a scene into brush strokes, or geometries, or by emphasizing its surface. Collage is another expression of this modernist impulse. I came to think of the FedEx works as an open-ended collage, an incremental composition of place names and barcodes. Also, you can't look at them without seeing other things through them. They work a bit like an optical device, reflecting and reframing the room around them, fragmenting and distorting it. The show starts with this machine that stands upright in the room like a figure. This was an old scanner that my New York gallery was going to throw away. It has been forced upright, and splayed apart like an exploded diagram. It continues to try to operate despite its circumstance. I think of it as being a melancholic zombie-like figure, a body that persists despite the loss of its former purpose. It's titled Office Work. I'm often drawn to polysemy when I title works or exhibitions. I like how a seemingly neutral term can open up numerous associations. The title for the show, Standard Deviations, is borrowed from statistics. But it sounds oxymoronic, or even perverse, when removed from that context. What is a standard type of deviance? The term also has clinical and moral associations. Deviance is something that society tries to control and repress. It's threatening.
All systems try to repress deviance. They treat the world as an abstraction in order to excise its unruliness. That is why I am drawn to the problem of abstraction, not only in aesthetics, but how it is used to structure daily life.
The repressed always arises in an unexpected form. Often it hides in the mundane and the common. I began collecting these signs during the credit crisis. They started to appear all over Los Angeles, like a colorful rash on a diseased body. I suppose I think of the works as portable monuments to the cold brutality of capitalism.
How it so often cheerfully chooses profits over people, abstraction over life.
The desktop surrogate started by thinking about the social labor that takes place in a museum or gallery, a labor that art depends on, yet is largely invisible. I was thinking of those working surfaces as an arena of social interaction, so I replaced them with identical copper tabletops that would record the bodily traces of that labor. I was also interested in drawing attention to the aesthetic management of the spaces which present art. How they influenced a public's understanding of the art on view. So I treated the furniture itself as a ready-made form for the artwork. Meaning isn't located in the object, but in the object's relation to the whole system which supports and produces it. Circulation and display are inseparable from any meaningful understanding of what art is. I think of my practice as an ecosystem, a set of interdependent relations that have an internal logic, which is dependent on other systems that have their own independent logics. The purpose of an art practice isn't just to make things, but to create meaningful relations between things. The selected works are made from works I decided not to exhibit. Rather than throw those works away, I reintegrated them into my practice, digested them, used them as a raw material, and excreted them again. Every positive choice to make something produces side effects, and those side effects are another way to understand what one has made. Early on, I came to the conclusion that art only had meaning when it was in circulation among people, when it was seen and trafficked. It made sense to try to use this circulation as a raw material for the work, to make it an integral element, rather than treating it as something external to the work's existence. I started by asking, what materials are best at registering their own movement? That led me to using glass, which cracks under pressure, and then copper, which is highly reactive to touch. It was important that both were reflective. In each you have the trace of its contact with the world, and a reflection of that world simultaneously. These initial ideas prompted me to make the FedEx works, and later the copper surrogates. Using the handling and circulation of an artwork as a production method led to other questions. It led me to think about the circulation systems that art relies on, and the bureaucracies that manage global logistics. I wanted to better understand what their rules were, and to consider the huge number of people, and all the competing agendas involved. By extension, it led to a deeper curiosity about the art system, about all the people who conspire to make art possible. In 2006 I started photographing everyone I worked with. This is what began the industrial portraits. I've now photographed about 1,400 people, 136 exposure roll of film for each person. Curators, art installers, collectors, journalists, and so on, in the midst of our working together. I wanted to understand how my activities connected me to a large network of people, how my practice was indebted to the efforts of so many others. So from one work you begin to look at the world around you in a different way, and that produces more questions, and more works. You can't see the world in itself clearly. You need a lens, a model, a way of organizing it to make it comprehensible. Each work presents me with a way of looking at the world, an approach. Each work is a proposition that I try to follow to the point of its exhaustion. I think of that as my obligation as a practitioner. But I would not say that I'm the author of my work, that the ideas within it are my possession. All objects are collectively produced, whether it be my work, a soda bottle, or an office chair. Every object is the result of a multitude of people's collective efforts. If I had to describe it, I would say I feel more like a functionary in an expansive complex system. Which is not to say that I don't feel an obligation to think critically and ethically about what I do. Rather, I think it puts that obligation into stark relief. We are all participants in systems larger than ourselves. And we are all equally responsible for the system we collectively produce. Bye-bye.
So thank you for this video, Walead. Is there anything immediate you wanted to add to that and continue? Because I would have a question. And let me just unmute you, or you unmute yourself.
I'm back. Okay. So I thought that that would condense a lot, and maybe there would be questions about the robot voice or how that was produced. And it was also a collective, the curator, a lot of those statements are very definitive and a little bit overly, how would I put that? A little bit too declaratory for me to feel necessarily comfortable with. So it's to understand that it was something produced in relationship between me and Lynn Kotzt, who was the curator of the show. And he felt like, oh no, you should pick the parts of our conversation that are very clear, and it has to be clear in this short time frame. So that was part of the thought process behind that voice and the way it was edited together, if that makes sense, to somewhat acknowledge that. If you like, I can show just a few pictures of the recent show at Pressenhuber.
Yeah,
and it's in a lot of ways kind of, I'll just show quickly and then we can just start talking, you know, if there's questions, but just because it's the most recent thing and I don't really know what I think of it completely yet anyway, so we can decide what we think together. So I'm gonna share again. Let's see, here's an image. So, share screen. Okay, there we go. Photos. Share. So you should see it now. This is just the first room, and these are two of the sign boxes that, as it was said in the video, they're just signs that started appearing in Los Angeles. There are all these generic sort of pleas of small businesses, usually for people in states, various states of suffering. So immigration, sell your house, but also, as is very American Christian sort of messages, Jesus, the way, the truth, the life, etc. And in the show, it was the first show where I've been making these newspaper works, these collages, I guess since 2012. They're made while I'm traveling only, when I'm working only. And they're just always the same pattern, based on the offset print sheet size. I just cut a circle. They're blind. I cut them face down, so I don't really know what I'm cutting. And the choice is also dependent on where I am. So this was when I was in Zurich. This was from the Alitalia lounge. There's Omaggio Alitalia. This was in Italy as well. There's another international New York Times. That was from Japan. It's from Japan. I didn't do that on purpose. A few of those are from Japan. I've only been to Japan 3 times, so it's kind of random. But, and so just continuing the show. And then what's totally new were these sort of money collages. These are US dollars. They're basically they're produced as much as there's demand, and the cost of them is 100 times the face value of the note. So the $1 bill is $100, $2 bill is $200, $5 bill is $500, 1,000, 5,000. Wait, am I doing the math? Yeah, no, 5. Sorry. Yeah, 50. I'm out of order. 2,000, and then 10,000 is the 100. But then, of course, Swiss money goes from 10 Swiss francs all the way up to 1,000. So that would technically be 100,000 Swiss francs. So it was to make a work that's virtually identical, is related directly to the scarcity prescribed by the issuer of the currency, is fully traceable because they all have serial numbers, and yet is a unique work, but that the ostensibly how much someone wants to pay for this particular formal arrangement dictates the scarcity of the work itself, if that makes sense. I also wanted to make something that was totally affordable on one end and also would satisfy higher end consumers on the other. And I think that translated into no one wanting to pay 100,000 Swiss francs for a note, but that's fine. And in the last room, so these are all the newspapers, and in the last room were the screens. The boxes are silk screened, and these are the original screens that were used to make the boxes in the other room, assembled into boxes. You kind of see them there, and they have a kind of transparency, and they're also stained. And then I also began photographing there kind of around the same time in LA, where as these signs were going up, were these camper home sort of, basically Hoovervilles, or Hooverville is a particularly American term named after Herbert Hoover, the president at the beginning of the Depression. Basically temporary residences that become permanent because of the financial situation, and also COVID caused a much larger problem with working families not having stable homes. So again, it's a kind of modular that is linked to a kind of decay within the system. And they also have these extraordinarily ironic names, like that mobile home is called Pinnacle, you know, the height, or one is called the Commander, you know. They all have these sort of grandiose American landscape types of names, exploration, etc. And they're basically crippled vehicles that come out of a real systemic failure of the country. So Bounder, and that's it. So with that, you know, these are just details of the other boxes. So I'll stop sharing and start sharing in another way. So how do we turn off? Yeah, there it is. Stop share. Okay.
So thank you so much for this walk through your practice, and also, let's say, about 20 years of practice already. I thought it was really funny to have you play us this video walk through the Winterthur exhibition with this robot generative voice, because let's say in the warm-up of this conversation, we were talking a bit about the general or canonized formats of art talks, and what is meant to be also delivered by that. And since you're someone dealing with all kinds of outlets and forms of communication within the art field, I thought it was pretty funny that it started kind of to feedback on our format here too. Nevertheless, I was wondering, because this video existed in an earlier version without the voiceover, only with a text. So you really consciously chose that computer generated voice to emphasize this point even further.
Yeah, I wanted the speech act would get more continuity, and also the reading. People complained about reading it as at the same time as looking at it, and that, you know, when you read a text, I mean, of course, that's a very modernist discourse. I mean, the difference between painting text and writing text, right? Representing text and writing text, and it's this kind of perceptual shift that when you're visually looking at something and perceiving it in terms of shape and form, and then you're reading, that it's difficult. So it started from just a very mundane thing where people were like, I can't read it fast enough and it's very distracting. I don't look at the images or I just read it. And I was, and the thought of rereading it first was deeply uncomfortable to me because I don't like to hear my own voice. And also it's like, why am I speaking this text that's based on a speech act in the first place, right? So it started with this conversation, then we cleaned up the grammar, made it more concise. And then if I read it again, it would feel like some kind of weird, you know, dramatization, like a historical reenactment or something. Like, it just seemed odd. And so I always found those voices really fun. That actually is the one from the Naples airport. It's the same, it's called Daniel English. So I love that he has a name, and but it's a total algorithmic construction. And I also like the places where it mispronounces things and has its own version of, when we speak, I say, I don't finish my sentences, I glitch, but the computer glitches in a different way. So I like that layering of that was, a systematized form of trying to enunciate, these disruptions in speaking. So the mediation, I felt like, became more clear a little bit. I don't know. It was sort of, and it made me laugh, honestly.
Just one question before I quote Luca Büchler, who has a question as well, sticking a little bit with that film, because I've been wondering, did you plan on doing that? It was rather spontaneous or born out of the situation of COVID lasting through 2020 that Lynn Cost, the curator, and you came up with the idea to do a film? Or was it always clear that such a format of mediation would be included on the website? And
it was very much a reaction to COVID, because I mean, we just started to realize, oh, well, I mean, video is helpful in documenting exhibitions anyway. And then it closed right after it opened. So then we were like, okay, well, that's fine. We'll just do a video walkthrough. And then, and his question was, well, how do we structure the walkthrough? And should there be some sort of explanation of what you're seeing? And then I said, well, let's just have a conversation. So we had a 2-hour-long conversation and then transcribed it. And it was just like it was a mess of talking. Whenever you read a transcript, it's a total mess, and you're like, what was, it's hard to even. So then we started editing it together. And then that produced a video with just the text, and then the voiceover again was to try to solve that other problem. So it was very incremental, it was just adapting to each step, and very much in dialogue with Lynn, which is important to me too, because to see how my practice or what I do changes depending on the circumstance is always, it's how I learn. So I wanted it open, and sometimes curators are willing to play, and sometimes they don't, they don't want to, or they don't have time or whatever. And Lynn was very willing to play and open it up. So I just ran with it, and I made a lot more work for him because of that, but he went with it. So that's how it happened.
Mm-hmm. So first, Luca Büchler writes to us that he would be really interested to know how much you think of your work as being finished at some point. And that means also, could someone as a visitor still touch it, not being the art handler, not being part of this like usually hidden labor that goes into the installation process, but then on the sort of receiving end, but still being an active participant in your show? And also, I would add, even if at some point someone owns such a FedEx piece, but then it goes, I don't know, it's been resold, will it then be treated in a proper crate and shipped, or when does this process stop, or where are the borders?
So, of course, with art objects, it's all convention based. So, I try to maintain the conventions of the professional space that it's shown within. So visitors aren't invited to touch it any more than they're invited to touch a abstract expressionist painting that might have a thumbprint in it. It still adheres to those circumstances. So I try to, maintain those societal and normative strictures, but because I think that's when it becomes more interesting, is that when one is given the opportunity to think about how those conventional distinctions structure the work, right? Rather than breaking those rules. I'm more interested in making them clearer or more present, because I think that they're interesting rules about how divisions of labor work, how viewership works. In terms of possession with property, it's kind of like Duchamp's Sick Ready-Made. He said, you can take a Rembrandt and use it as an ironing board if you want. It's if you own it. So I suggest something, I suggest that, well, it's intended to be shipped via FedEx. If you want to preserve the work, you should ship it via FedEx. If you art handle it, it's not really preserving it. But just like de Kooning Rauschenberg erased the de Kooning, if someone owns the thing, they can do whatever they want. They can turn it into a coffee table. I can't really stop them. So that possibility to alter a work in its traffic and its commerce or its circulation is always part of it. And I think by extension, one would say no artwork is ever finished, in that strict sense, because it's always being reframed, you know, it's always being recontextualized. So rather than saying my work in particular is unfinished or always evolves, I would say all artworks are always evolving because they're always recontextualized historically or spatially or physically and whatnot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I think I've got a question here that we might treat earlier because probably makes a bridge to what you just said by Laura Bui. She's interested in your notion of art making as a contribution to the discourse of aesthetics, the very current and contemporary discourse and of aesthetic that she sees marked by commodity fetishism and iPhone aesthetics. And are there alternatives you propose by replicating or destructuring or deconstructing it? Or are there other methods to react to dominant aesthetics that interest you?
I mean, I think that's a big question, and I appreciate it. But I think I'm just trying to think of where to start. I'm a little bit of, I think that one can't have a fantasy about what their profession is. So to try to posit a whole new system out of nowhere is kind of impossible. And what I think my response to problems of dominance is that almost that dominance is over theorized. It's over asserted, you know, it's constantly re-theorized. And agent individuals have, you know, that collective, you know, democracy requires an accumulation of people to create structures of power, say. And that there's an agency that playing with the rule, no system really is perfect, and it's about trying to find little autonomous spaces within that system rather than saying the whole system is corrupt. So in conversation, I could say, yeah, I'm repulsed by a lot of the things that govern social interaction around capitalism or commodity fetishism or things like that. But one thing is to figure out how to posit a way to live that there's still possibilities within that system, and no, art never was ideal. You know, it just is another aspect of exchange, and that can be social exchange. And there's an overemphasis on market exchange, both within counter discourses and in the primary discourse, right? Because counter discourses overemphasize that the market is being, it keeps re-theorizing that dominance. So I think one way is to think about how one can misuse those structures of dominance, willfully misuse something, right? Like drill a hole through a TV, you know, and, or whatever, you know, and that there's spaces in that. That was really convoluted. My answer was really terrible, but I just think that I grew up with a lot of work when I was a student, a lot of practices that made dominance seem all, or repressive political forces seem all powerful. And I felt like that was just as problematic as willfully reifying a dominant system. And it was trying to find a space after, you know, a theoretical turn and a postmodern, post-structuralist or structuralist turn within art making. And to try to think, well, how do you not just reassert dominance at the same time as acknowledging it? And so I like things like visual seduction, you know, aesthetic attraction, pleasure, you know, I think is an important aspect of that. And I care about the way things look. I think pleasure is an important political force, but it's also to make things that have that sensorial experience of pleasure while not concealing how that pleasure is produced. And that's my little niche attempt at solving that conflict. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. Then we have Russell Gordon asking, hi, Walead. Or saying hi. In addition to making works, you also curate exhibitions. How does your curating practice relate to your art practice? Are they one and the same thing? Do you consider one of your curated exhibitions to operate in the same register as, say, a FedEx work?
Huh. I mean, I don't think of them the same way because I think the professional responsibilities are different. So when I organize a show, I want to be accountable in a similar way that one would be accountable, or an exhibition would need to present itself to a public. Does that make sense? So I wouldn't want to use the get out of jail free card of just an artist. You know, I'd want to be scrutinized in making an exhibition. But I think my interest in making shows was it allowed me to, I mean, on a personal level, allow me to learn from practices that I respected and be around the objects and understand them better than I could otherwise. And so I would say that, like, organizing exhibitions was very similar to writing for me because it was a way to think about aesthetic practice in a way that wasn't available to me as a producer. And it taught me. So in a selfish way, it was about that self-instruction or being able to learn through it. In another sense, what's primarily important to me is the discourse about aesthetics. So there were ideas that I felt like I wanted to participate in and discuss that, again, weren't available as a producer, you know, necessarily. Yeah.
Okay. I have another question concerning that very recent show you showed us last, that also brought in photographs of those vans, of the impermanent homes that's due to hardship of COVID-19 and financial situation of people in the US have become more permanent, like shelters for the people living there. And I just observed in that array of work of yours from the last 20 years, although you have been photographing, let's say, passages, American passages, also for a longer time, you today really showed us aesthetic objects that reveal the processes of circulation within the art field. Now bringing in those images or those photographs that have a slightly more documentary or a different documentary character that sort of transgresses the art field. Yeah, I was wondering about that. Is it due to this current immediateness of a crisis that of course also affects the art field, that you kind of go out of the art field to reflect what's going on rather than making it a point that shows haven't been happening or haven't been shown, or pieces haven't been shown, or fairs haven't taken place, or something one could imagine that is more intrinsic to that field?
Well, I think, I mean, on one side, I think there's no way to the world is always being reframed through one's primary professional expertise, right? So there's a history of that kind of documentary practice, but also within conceptual art, there's a history of it. So I think of them as highly conventional photographs in a certain way, like very much about, you know, as much about, say, the contemporary circumstance as it is about a history of representation of contemporary circumstances. So, you know, just in terms of recent 20th century kind of precedents is Walker Evans' Homes for Americans, Dan Graham's Homes for America, which is like kind of a, I mean, Dan claims that he wasn't thinking about Walker Evans, but it's like crazy to say that. But they're interesting together, and they both were about industrialization, serialization, urban space, etc. Of course, and then the other kind of point of reference for me is Louis Baltz, who made a body of work. Well, I mean, one of the bodies of work that he made was New Industrial Parks of Irvine. Wait, I'm getting the title wrong. New Industrial. Anyway, the form of them is very similar to that form of Baltz's work, except that his were these New Industrial Parks of Irvine, California, I think. They're in Irvine, New Industrial Parks of Irvine. Anyway, I won't get hung up on that. But they were about these kind of untouched spaces and these brand new concrete, huge warehouse type spaces, these mute facades, the picture plane parallel to the surface of the buildings. And I was thinking about that too, as this sort of decay of the industrial architecture, right? This totally modular form of the home, Homes for Americans, but that one that wasn't alien in its industrial aspect, but was alien in the decay that it spoke to. I also feel kind of uncomfortable about those photographs because there's something problematic about them too. But I thought there's something equally problematic about the sign boxes and that they're all related to each other. They're these modular, you know, it's a modular frame. And then of course a photographic frame is a cell. And a cell is also what you would use to describe a prison cell. And they're also industrially produced. So it's like homes, images, you know, industry, but also falling apart, you know, in some way, you know, in the way that like photographic film reveals this grainy decay to pictorial transparency. But I still don't know how I feel about those works, to be honest. I just thought, fuck it, show them, you know? I mean, that's how you learn, is you put it out there and you see what happens, and hopefully someone asks you about it and you have to figure out what you were thinking, and then you learn, you know, so.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. And I have one last question from my side, but really would in the meantime encourage everyone again, like to come up with your last questions. We still got, let's say, 5 minutes left before we round it off. Something maybe really minor or simple, but I checked out your homepage. We're also having a lot of discussion in teaching, like how do artists represent themselves? We kind of want to look at it in a critical way, but also understand mechanisms. And your website is entitled Walead Beshty Studios Inc.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just say a few words about that decision?
Well, actually, the full title of the website, which is the max you can do for a URL, but it's actions taken under the fictitious name Walead Beshty Studios Inc. And fictitious name is your business name,
Mhm.
and it's your operating name. And of course, for taxes and just legal reasons, you have to have a business if you're selling things. And even though I'm just a consignor, I don't directly sell anything, that felt like a acknowledgement that the practice is different than me, right? It also is a kind of format that is part of a larger ecosystem. So I don't know that it addresses it in a very intelligent or complicated way, but it just made sense to me to try to. I love that, and I don't know if it's the same. I mean, it's ZHdK, I mean, like that idea, right? Like, and of course, I'm butchering French pronunciation, but the term for corporation is a anonymous society, right? Like, it's a corporation. It's a different entity. It's a corpus. It's a body, right? And that in the U.S. you use this term fictitious name, or DBA, doing business as, right? Which sort of, these are such weird terms, but they're kind of like my interest in the title of the show, you know, standard deviation. They're perverse, and they're, you know, so again, it's a mix of personal amusement, transparency, and I don't know, yeah. And someone actually bought my name, actually, at first. So the studio was like, we need to make some form of website, and then that became a huge, I mean, where do you stop with a website, right? That's always the issue with like digital containers, is like, where do you stop? You know, it bleeds into everything in the same way that social life bleeds into professional life. It also bleeds into extent, right? So where do you draw the lines? And that makes you crazy. And then when we tried to get, they initially, without even really, we didn't discuss it, but they were just like, oh, your name is taken. Well, that's really weird. So someone bought it as like a joke or something. I still don't understand why, but WaleadBeshty.com was gone. And then they finally released it when we had to come up with a name, and I was like, well, then what do you call it? And then I was like, well, maybe that's a good name. But anyway, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. I see no new questions in the chat. So that
It's okay. I won't take it personally.
was really the last chance. So I just have to thank you so much, Walead, for taking the time and granting you the insight. And as usual, if you are just trying to round it off now, someone has a question, and I'm still granting that one. It's from Gloria Galovic, asking, like, speaking about artwork, their distribution and handling, what are the most crucial imprints left on you since you are connected to the work you put in this circulation, you feed into this circulation.
Mm-hmm. So what's the impact on me personally?
I don't know. Yeah, probably bodily, personally.
Oh, I mean, personally, I like doing it, you know, and I learn a lot. You know, I almost feel like the job itself came as a result of figuring out what conversation I wanted to be a part of. So, I mean, I think that's one of the things that happen, and it relates to what we talked about initially. So it kind of goes full circle. But I think one of the best things about the job of artist, right, is also one of its hardest parts, is that you negotiate the terms under which you want to engage. You have to draw those boundaries because no one tells you what that job is, right? You sort of have to negotiate it. So that's a great thing because you can decide some of the conditions or the ways that you want to deal with the constraints. It's also daunting because it's like, how do I start? You know, it's not like, you know, you're a lawyer, you go to your first year at a law firm, then you go through this progression and you make your way to this and that. It's not a track quite the same way that other professions have. So, shit, I lost the question. I guess all I'm saying is that that engagement is what I think was fascinating to me initially, rather than the term or itself. It just seemed like the term described what I wanted to do by accident, if that makes sense. But it still was on my mind professionally, but it, like, I could have ended up just writing, or I could have ended up working at an institution. I just wanted to be involved with art in some way because I had questions about aesthetics and things I was thinking about with it. And the actual final result of being designated artist versus some other art-related job was unintentional. It wasn't necessarily, but it just happened to be that's where things progressed, you know. Does that make sense? It's a little convoluted, but.
I think at least she thanks us for addressing and answering questions.
I'll take the thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so, and I double up on that thank you again for taking the time, walking us through your practice and granting insights into your approach and what you've been doing also most recently. So.
My pleasure, thank you.
I also hope you enjoy your teaching with the students from ZHdK. And please stay safe and healthy, as we all try to, and see you around, hopefully at some point again in Zurich or Switzerland.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. Thank you.